The dust had barely settled in Rafah when the cries began. A wave of grief, laced with fury, swept through the streets, echoing the raw devastation. Homes, once filled with laughter and life, lay in ruins. The air hung heavy with the stench of death and the acrid bite of explosives. This was not a battlefield, it was a neighborhood. And its inhabitants, ordinary people caught in an extraordinary tragedy, were left to sift through the rubble, both physical and emotional. The world watched in horror as images of the aftermath flickered across television screens and flooded social media feeds. There was no escaping the raw agony etched on the faces of survivors, the heart-wrenching sight of children's toys amidst the debris. The attack on Rafah, a city already scarred by years of conflict, felt different. It felt like a tipping point, a stark reminder of the human cost of a conflict that seemed to have no end in sight. The immediate aftermath was a blur of chaotic activity. Rescue workers, their faces grim with determination, toiled tirelessly to pull survivors from the wreckage, their efforts a desperate race against time. Medics, overwhelmed by the sheer scale of the casualties, struggled to cope with the influx of injured. The wounded, many bearing horrific injuries, bore silent testament to the brutal efficiency of modern warfare. As the dust settled and the initial shock subsided, a collective sense of anger and bewilderment took hold. How could this happen? Who was responsible? And how could such a tragedy be prevented from happening again? These were just some of the questions swirling through the minds of people around the world, their collective conscience shaken by the events in Rafah. From the rubble of Rafah emerged a chorus of condemnation, swift and unyielding. World leaders, usually cautious in their pronouncements, expressed outrage and called for immediate action. The United Nations, often criticized for its perceived impotence, demanded an independent investigation, its calls echoing those of human rights groups around the world. Benjamin Netanyahu, the Israeli prime minister, facing mounting international pressure, defended his nation's actions. He insisted that the strike was a necessary response to rocket fire from Gaza, a claim disputed by many who pointed to the high number of civilian casualties as evidence of a disproportionate use of force. The international community, however, remained unconvinced. The attack on Rafah, coming as it did on the heels of weeks of escalating tensions, felt like a dangerous escalation, a slide back into a cycle of violence that many had hoped was a thing of the past. The fragile peace, painstakingly constructed over years of negotiations, seemed to hang by a thread. The echoes of the Rafah attack reverberated far beyond the Middle East, sparking protests and demonstrations in cities around the world. From London to Paris, from Tokyo to New York, people took to the streets, their voices united in a cry for peace and justice. The message was clear: the world was watching, and it had seen enough. To understand the depth of the tragedy in Rafah, one must delve into the troubled history of Gaza. This narrow strip of land bordering Israel and Egypt has long been a focal point of conflict, a tinderbox of geopolitics and historical grievances. Its people, subjected to years of occupation and economic hardship, have borne the brunt of a conflict not of their making. Gaza, once a bustling hub of trade and commerce, has been reduced to an open-air prison, its borders tightly controlled, its economy in ruins. The people of Gaza, many of them refugees from previous conflicts, have endured hardship with remarkable resilience, clinging to hope even in the face of despair. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict, a Gordian knot of competing narratives and historical claims, casts a long shadow over Gaza. The establishment of Israel in 1948, while a joyous occasion for Jews around the world, resulted in the displacement of hundreds of thousands of Palestinians, many of whom ended up in Gaza. This mass exodus, known as the Nakba, or catastrophe in Arabic, remains a deeply traumatic event in the Palestinian psyche, fueling resentment and distrust towards Israel. Over the decades, Gaza has witnessed a series of wars and uprisings, each leaving its mark on the physical and psychological landscape. The Oslo Accords, signed in the 1990s, offered a glimmer of hope, a roadmap to a peaceful resolution. However, the failure to implement key aspects of the agreement, coupled with continued settlement expansion in the West Bank, fueled further disillusionment and anger, creating fertile ground for extremist groups to flourish. Section 4. Between retaliation and restraint. The Rafah incident, like a stone thrown into a still pond, sent ripples of uncertainty across the region. On one side, there were calls for retaliation, for revenge against those deemed responsible for the carnage. Hamas, the militant group that controls Gaza, vowed to avenge the deaths of its people, its rhetoric fueling fears of a wider conflagration. On the other side, voices of restraint urged calm and called for a de-escalation of hostilities. They argued that further violence would only exacerbate the suffering and push the prospect of a lasting peace further out of reach. These voices, often drowned out by the clamor for retribution, represented the only hope for a future free from bloodshed. The international community, caught in the middle of this volatile situation, faced a difficult balancing act. Condemning the attack while urging restraint, they sought to prevent a dangerous escalation while also addressing the root causes of the conflict. The challenge, however, lay in translating words into action, in transforming good intentions into tangible progress on the ground. The specter of a wider conflict loomed large, casting a long shadow over the region. The situation in Gaza, already dire before the Rafah incident, threatened to deteriorate further, exacerbating an already dire humanitarian crisis. The international community, faced with a complex and intractable conflict, struggled to find a way forward, a path that would lead to a just and lasting peace. Section 5. The world watches and waits. The world held its breath, watching and waiting to see what the aftermath of the Rafah airstrike would bring. Would it be a catalyst for peace, a tragic wake-up call that forced all sides to the negotiating table? Or would it be the spark that ignited a wider conflagration, plunging the region into yet another cycle of violence and despair? The eyes of the world were fixed on Gaza, a place often described as a powder keg, its people trapped in a seemingly endless cycle of violence and suffering. Their resilience, their ability to find hope even in the darkest of times, served as a testament to the human spirit, a beacon of light in a region often shrouded in darkness. The international community, often accused of apathy and inaction, found itself at a crossroads. Would it continue to stand on the sidelines, offering condolences and condemnations, while the situation on the ground continued to deteriorate? Or would it finally take decisive action, using its diplomatic and economic leverage to pressure all sides to choose the path of peace? The answer to these questions, and the fate of millions of people, hung in the balance. The world watched and waited, hoping against hope that the tragedy in Rafah would not be in vain, that it would serve as a turning point, a moment of reckoning that would finally break the cycle of violence and usher in a new era of peace and prosperity. Section 6. Can peace ever bloom in the desert? In the wake of the Rafah tragedy, the question lingered: can peace ever bloom in the arid desert of mistrust and animosity? Can the cycle of violence, deeply rooted in decades of conflict and displacement, be broken? The answer, as elusive as ever, lay not in the pronouncements of politicians or the resolutions of international bodies, but in the hearts and minds of ordinary people, both Israeli and Palestinian. True peace, lasting peace, could not be imposed from above. It had to grow from below, nurtured by empathy, understanding, and a shared desire for a better future. It required a fundamental shift in perspectives, a willingness to see the humanity in the other, to recognize the shared pain and aspirations that transcended the political and ideological divides. Education, often hailed as the cornerstone of a just and equitable society, held the key to breaking down the walls of prejudice and mistrust. By fostering dialogue and understanding between young people, by teaching them to embrace their shared history while acknowledging their differences, there was hope that a new generation could emerge, one less burdened by the weight of the past, more willing to embrace a future of peace and coexistence. The road to peace would be long and arduous, fraught with obstacles and setbacks. But the alternative, a perpetual cycle of violence and despair, was simply unacceptable. The people of Gaza, and indeed the entire region, deserved better. They deserved a future where their children could grow up in safety and security, where their talents and aspirations could flourish, and where the echoes of war would be replaced by the sweet sounds of peace.